The Americans were firing at nothing. Not soldiers, not tanks. Not even a single hidden sniper in the tree-line. Nothing. Just empty mud, silent roads, and fields where no one was standing. And somehow, this nothing was destroying the German army. If you were a German soldier on Hill 192, you were part of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. You were elite. You'd survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. You'd lived through the meat grinder of Monte Cassino. You were a professional survivor who knew every trick in the book. But in the summer of Normandy, the rules of survival didn't just break. They vanished. There is a detail buried in the official after-action reports of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division that makes no sense. It's a statistic so bizarre that for decades, it was treated as a clerical error. The Americans were firing 20 times on target missions every single night. Let's stop and look at the math that the German High Command couldn't wrap their heads around. A time on target mission, or TOT, is the ultimate expression of industrial murder. Imagine 100 heavy guns. Some are light 105mm howitzers 3 miles away. Some are massive 155mm long toms 10 miles back. The shells from the distant guns take 45 seconds to arrive. The shells from the near guns take 12 seconds. American Fire Direction Centers, using human computers and mechanical slide rules, calculated the exact split second for every single battery to fire, so that every single shell hit the exact same square meter of Earth at the exact same microsecond. It wasn't a bombardment. It was a physical erasure of the map. On a single day in July, the American guns fired 13,000 rounds on this one single hill. To put that in perspective, that is more ammunition than some German divisions saw in an entire month of combat. But here is the mystery. They weren't aiming at the Germans. They were firing at empty crossroads. They were firing at silent hedgerows the Americans had already captured. They were firing at mud. The German officers watched from their reinforced concrete bunkers, and they laughed. They called the Americans amateurs. In the Wehrmacht, every shell was a precious resource. You didn't pull the lanyard unless you saw the enemy's eyes. You calculated the wind, you measured the distance, and you made it count. To the Germans, the Americans were wasteful children who hadn't been taught how to count. They saw this as proof of American incompetence. They were dead wrong. The Americans didn't miss. They just stopped aiming. You see, the Germans were looking for a battle. The Americans were performing an industrial cleaning. They weren't firing at where the Germans were. They were firing at where the Germans wanted to be. By hitting an empty road every 15 minutes, the Americans made movement a death sentence. By hitting an empty field at 3 a.m., they made sleep a luxury that no German soldier could afford. By hitting a silent hedgerow where no one was hiding, they ensured that no German scout could ever crawl forward to see what was coming next. The Americans weren't fighting an army. They were clearing the map, inch by agonizing inch. They had realized a terrifying truth of modern warfare. You don't have to find the enemy if you simply destroy the ground he is standing on. The Germans were looking for an opponent they could outthink and outmaneuver. Instead, they found a factory line that ended in their front yard. They were about to find out that in an industrial war, precision is just a very slow way to die. And the Germans had no idea what was actually happening. They were trapped in a logic of scarcity, while the Americans were playing a game of total aggregate power. The nothing they were firing at. It was the grave the German army was already standing in. They just didn't know it yet. While the Americans were flooding the earth with steel, the mighty German Wehrmacht was living a desperate lie. To understand the horror of Normandy, you have to understand one number. It's a number that sat on the desk of every German battery commander like a death sentence. 50. That was the limit. 50 shells. That was the daily ration for a heavy German gun on the Western Front in 1944. Think about the reality of that. If a U.S. tank column appeared on the horizon, a German gunner had exactly 10 minutes of fire. After 10 minutes, his ammo was gone. After 10 minutes, his multi-million-dollar Krupp cannon was nothing more than a heavy piece of machined scrap metal. The world has been sold a myth. We see the Tiger tanks and the V-2 rockets in documentaries, and we assume the Nazi army was a high-tech juggernaut. It's a lie. While they were building jet fighters in underground bunkers, they were still moving their artillery with horses. In 1944, the most advanced army in Europe had over 1.2 million horses in active service. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was actually powered by animals. If a horse died in the mud, the gun stayed in the mud. If a horse starved, the shells didn't move. This was Napoleon's technology being used in the age of industrial murder. It was a 19th century logistics system trying to survive a 20th century hell. General Hans Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, wrote secret reports describing his artillery as a total mess. And he wasn't exaggerating. His inventory was a disaster of history. He had captured Czech guns from 1939, French guns from the 1940 collapse. Russian howitzers dragged 2,000 miles from the east. None of them used the same shells. None of them used the same spare parts. Imagine being a German supply sergeant in a midnight rainstorm. You have 10 different guns, and you have to find 10 different types of ammunition, while American shells are exploding 50 yards away. It wasn't just difficult, it was a logistical suicide note. Because of this scarcity, the Germans became obsessed with one thing: precision. They had to be perfect. They had to make every single gram of gunpowder count. A German artillery crew was arguably the best trained in the world. They were surgical. They could put a shell inside a 50-meter circle from 10 kilometers away on the first shot. It was professional. It was beautiful. And in the summer of 1944, it was totally irrelevant. The German system was built on pre-plotted survey positions. To fire a single effective shot, they needed 15 minutes of manual, agonizing math. They had to calculate the humidity, the wind speed, and the rotation of the Earth, all with a pencil and paper. In the chaos of Normandy, 15 minutes is an eternity. By the time the German officer finished his calculations, by the time he gave the order to fire his precious 50 shells, the Americans were already 2 miles down the road. They were already drinking coffee and calling in another 1,000 rounds on his position. The Germans were fighting a war of arithmetic. They were counting their shells like a poor man counts his last pennies before the rent is due. They hid their guns in the woods. They conserved their ammo. They waited for that one perfect shot that would never come. But the Americans had thrown the calculator away. They didn't want to hit the gun. They didn't care about the perfect shot. They wanted to drown the ground the gun was standing on. The Americans realized a truth that the professional German officers couldn't accept. In an industrial war, precision is the weapon of the loser. The Germans were counting pennies. The Americans were moving a river. And a river doesn't care how good your math is. A river just flows until everything in its path is buried under the weight of the water. The German officers looked at their maps and saw a battlefield. The Americans looked at the map and saw a factory line. The Germans were about to find out that being perfect is just a very slow, very lonely way to die. By August 1944, German soldiers had a new fear. Not tanks, not planes, not even the sniper hiding in the church tower. They were terrified of the silence. Because in Normandy, silence was a warning. Silence meant the American math was done. Silence meant the river was about to flow again. The Americans had a different name for this. They called it H&I fire, harassing and interdiction. It sounds clinical, boring, but on the ground, it was a nightmare designed to break the human mind. In the German manual, you fire if you see a target. In the American manual, you fire because the target might be there, or because you want to make sure the enemy never feels the sun on his face again. Imagine you are that German soldier. You haven't slept in 4 days. Your ears are ringing. The air tastes like cordite and burnt rubber. Suddenly, crack. One shell hits the road 200 yards away. You dive. You wait. 5 minutes of dead silence. You think it's over. You try to close your eyes. Crack. Another one. Then nothing for 20 minutes. Then 3 shells in 10 seconds. The Americans weren't trying to hit your foxhole. They were aiming at your nervous system. They were turning elite soldiers into shaking, hollowed-out shells of men. They were buying victory with the production power of Michigan and Ohio. How did they afford this? How could they throw away thousands of tons of steel on maybe targets? The answer is a truck. Specifically, the Red Ball Express. The German High Command looked at the map of France and saw a dead end. The bridges were gone. The railways were twisted metal. They assumed the Americans would run dry in a week. The Americans looked at that same map and built a river. Nearly 6,000 trucks, the legendary deuce and a half, running 24/7 on dedicated one-way loops. If a truck broke down, they pushed it into the ditch. If a tire blew, they kept driving on the rim. At its peak, This system moved 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. And here is the truth history often ignores. 3/4 of these drivers were African-American soldiers. Men who were often kept away from the front lines by segregated army, became the literal heartbeat of the war. They drove through minefields with no headlights. They drove through snipers. They drove until they hallucinated from exhaustion. They kept the river flowing so fast that American officers told war correspondents, "We have more guns than we know what to do with." By the time the Allies reached the Rhine in 1945, the math was over. The Americans stopped pretending to fight a traditional war. They just flattened everything in front of them. 4,000 guns opened up at once. 1,000 rounds per minute. The German defenders didn't even try to fight back. They didn't look for cover. They just sat in their bunkers, staring at the walls, waiting for the end. They were shell-shocked in the most literal sense of the word. The German major who called the Americans incompetent was right about the waste, but he was dead wrong about the war. The American gunners weren't just soldiers. They were the operators of a massive industrial hammer. They weren't wasting ammunition. They were buying the lives of their friends with the production power of Detroit. They wiped the ground clean, so their infantry didn't have to die for every inch of it. If your family was part of this river of steel, whether they pulled the lanyard or drove the trucks, put their name in the comments. Because history isn't just about who fired the last shot. It's about who could afford not to stop. Hit like to keep these stories alive. This is History's Battle Lines.